Right, so the focus for today's recording is chapter 6 for those in elective and chapter 9 for those in pure. Really looking at the factors leading to German and Japan's defeat. This will be different from the timeline lesson. The timeline lesson looks at it in a chronological manner. This one will go through the slides and then you will just see me talk about the slides in a more country specific manner. What do I mean? Really, it's looking at the strengths of the allies here, right? You have one, two, three countries that are important in contributing to the success of the Allied forces, and you have two of the Axis members responsible for their own defeat through their miscalculations, through their mistakes as well. Right, so that's pretty much the overview of the chapter. So I'll talk about America first, then Britain, then Soviet Union, followed by Germany and Japan. Right, so really this is a more country-specific manner to understand the chapter, and for those who don't like the chronology, this would be a different way to actually understand the chapter. Right, so the earlier question that I had that I think by now should be a bit more familiar. Wars end in no specific manner. Ultimately, if a leader chooses to surrender, I think that would be the most obvious way. So in the case of Japan, the Americans had demanded, or the Allied forces had demanded unconditional surrender, and when Emperor Hirohito chose to make that decision after the dropping of the atomic bomb, that's how the war ended in Asia Pacific. And for Germany, it was a case of Hitler recognizing that there's no chance for success whatsoever because Berlin, the capital of Germany, was occupied by the Soviet forces, and the British and the Americans are coming in from another part of Berlin. Really, it seemed obvious that they were going to lose, so he committed suicide. The person he handed over power to chose to surrender, right? So that's how wars end. Understanding this is very important when you are trying to articulate and explain or link back your answer, your paragraph back to the question. Okay, moving on, strength of the allies. So these are the three countries, America, Britain, and the Soviet Union. So just some things I tend to include to just make it so, the comic Captain America was set in the context of World War II. And if you watch the movie Captain America, the first one, it would actually talk about how Captain America, all right, the character Captain America was keen to actually join the war effort. So that's how actually media played a role in galvanizing America's support for the war effort. Okay, a character most familiar or should be increasingly familiar is Roosevelt, President of the United States of America. He was the president during the Great Depression, early 1930s, and it was his policies that actually helped America quite a fair bit. He is loved by those in the lower and maybe lower middle class, all right, because of his policies that really introduced some form of welfare into American system, and his optimism had inspired people during World War II, during hardship of the 1930s as well. So a lot could be said about him. He was the only four-term American president. They actually changed the law after his untimely death in 1945, just when America was quite clearly going to impose themselves at the respective conferences to mark the end of World War II. Right. So yeah, he died just before victory was achieved. Played a substantial role in leading America during World War II. But okay, we don't want to talk too unnecessary about that. So yes, there are a lot of these are like today considered vintage posters designed to actually inspire, recruit Americans to get behind the war effort, whether it comes to recruitment, all right, enlist recruiting, or simply ensuring that the war effort was substantial. So now we look at specific factors, all right, and the first factor here is the economic and military power of America. Yet pre-Pearl Harbor, America was reluctant to be involved. Roosevelt himself had campaigned to win the elections by making a case that he was not someone who is not a warmonger, and that he will respect the wishes of the Americans who overwhelmingly did not want America to be involved in the war. Of course, after Pearl Harbor, there was hardly any resistance to America's active involvement. So America's vast resources were mobilized. All right, this came in the form of people, factories, shipyards, farms, Hollywood. Anything and everyone and everything could be tapped on to actually ensure that whatever advantage America needed, America got. All right, so yeah, we even have Hollywood drumming home the fact that the Japs and the Germans and the Italians, the Axis forces, are all bad. You can watch this cartoon on your own time. All right. So even Walt Disney was part of the Allied war effort in the sense that they were trying to drum up support against the Axis powers. Watching. All right. So within months, America was rebuilding its fleet that was attacked at Pearl Harbor. All right, training troops, producing weapons, and other essential equipment. Right. Axis war production never met the Allied war effort, even at the height of Germany's victory. So, yeah, the rate at which America produced weapons, in very simple terms, compared to the Japanese, it was in some instances closer to the end of the war. America would be able to produce about 10, 15 times faster than the Japanese. So in terms of sustaining a long war, it was no stretch of the imagination to think that Germany and Japan cannot match that of the Allies. From 1942 onwards, US supplied allies with food, raw material, industrial equipment, weapons and ammunition, ships and aircraft. So, yep, essentially this was part of the Land-Lease Act. All right, you would have read this as Land-Lease Act in my timeline. Okay, of course, not just Britain, even Soviet Union, or especially Soviet Union, uh, definitely benefited from the Land-Lease Act. All right, in those winter months, this material that arrived from the northernmost ports of Soviet Union, the uh, Siberian ports, proved to be critical supplies for Soviet Union as they mount the counteroffensive in Moscow and the counteroffensive in Stalingrad. Right, so Arsenal of Democracy, yeah, it wasn't my idea to put this logo, but maybe if it helps you remember. These are the numbers we are looking at, right? Sometimes numbers don't really make sense, but the idea is its sheer volume actually overwhelmed Japan, overwhelmed Germany, who, once the war began, really struggled to actually gain any momentum in producing their own weapons. Remember, America itself was very far away from the war, so they were not at all disturbed by the war, unlike Japan, whose supplies were cut by island hopping, and Germany, whose oil supplies were destroyed by the Royal Air Force, by the American Air Force as well. In terms of their support for resistance, so the Kuomintang in China was fighting the Japanese, received support from America. Any anti Japanese movement, any resistance movement. All right, so something familiar, perhaps the MPAJ, the Malayan People's Anti Japanese Army, the Viet Minh. Also, someone who will know a bit more about when we are studying Vietnam War. All of them actually all benefited from America's industrial output, right? So, okay, but honestly, if you were given the choice of choosing a factor that really led to the success of the Allied forces, I'm quite reluctant to recommend that you choose this factor because this one, yes, it shows that America was a team player, but it did not comprehensively show that America caused or this resistance movement played a pivotal role in defeating Japan and Germany. Right. Yeah. So the question that in class I will get students to ponder about, yeah, the Atlantic Ocean, this vast body of ocean that separates North America and Europe. So America's ability to actually win the Battle of the Atlantic was crucial in. So this is America. America is here. America needs to help UK here. All right, they need to cross the Atlantic Ocean, but it's easier said than done. All right, so these are all the routes that they took. Okay, going up north, this is the Arctic route. Okay, and all these red dots are merchant ships that were sunk by the German U-boats in World War II. Really, for the longest period of time, the U-boats rule or reign through the Atlantic Ocean. All right, so it took a lot of effort for America to eventually dominate the Atlantic Ocean. All right, so some of the things we need to mention about. Okay, US, as part of their Land Lease Act or their Land Lease Scheme, they wanted to help the British. I showed you just now. They need to get from USA to the UK, but they didn't have control of the Atlantic Ocean because of frequent attacks by the German subs. So yes, initially the U-boats were effective in sinking British merchant ships. So some of the things that would swing this particular battle in favor of the Americans would be the success of the British intelligence. Of course, okay, this was at Bletchley Park. They were, of course, supported by Polish intelligence as well, and of course, the one of the men behind the success is Alan Turing. All right, so yes, being able to decode the Enigma machine, which is the German code system, really allowed the Americans to bypass and really, basically they eventually went through the U-boats rather easily once they were able to understand where the U-boats were. Okay, furthermore, America also worked on specific weapons, particularly effective in naval warfare, things like depth charges. Right, can't write there, I realize, depth charges. They invested heavily on radar technology as well. All this eventually forced the Germans to call off their U-boat attack. Right, it was that devastating that they didn't even send out any more U-boats. They used it just to defend the Atlantic Wall, defend Germany from invasion, and defend the German occupied France from Allied invasion. Yep. So that pretty much summed up America's substantial effort at the Battle of Atlantic. Then you also are familiar with the island hopping strategy in Asia Pacific right after America's success at the Battle of Midway, and they had increased dominance at the Pacific Ocean. So they worked on island hopping using air attacks and submarine to isolate Japanese held areas. Yep, and then they will focus on poorly defended islands and try to cut supplies of the well-defended islands. Right, so this was the game plan. Allowed allies to incur fewer casualties, come within striking distance. I think by the time they were in the Marianas Chain at Battle of Saipan, after Battle of Saipan, they could directly, the B-29 could actually take off from Saipan or from the islands around there to bomb Tokyo directly. Okay, so crucial successes in enabling the Americans to really get close to Japan. Then, of course, you had the atomic bomb that really forced Japan into submission. So also a key reason for Japanese surrender. All right. What about Britain? Britain is a bit tricky, I would say, because naturally, we tend to give a lot of effort to the Americans for the success in Asia and the success on the Western Front, and then Soviet Union gets credit for success at the Eastern Front. But what about Britain? Right? So Britain's success is actually immense. For the very simple reason that they were able to resist and stave off the Germans' attacks. There were British politicians who wanted to surrender to the Germans because the Germans would have promised that Britain would not be occupied, but would have to surrender its Royal Navy. And Lord Halifax was somewhat open to this idea. There were a lot of plots and counter plots and spies and whatnot. But Churchill was adamant that, that speech that I showed some of you, will fight in the beaches, on the landing strips, will fight, and that they will never surrender. So this man, once in charge, at least it ensured that the British resolve was very, very solid. Yeah. So eventually, Germany launched their Operation Sea Lion to dominate the air, to dominate the sky, and then possibly to launch a naval invasion of Britain. But that did not, or it didn't materialize in that manner, all right. The RAF had their Spitfires and the Hurricanes, who were comparable to the Luftwaffe. The Luftwaffe actually had amazing success, actually targeting British factories initially, but when they decided to move on to focus on the British civilian areas, it was a good opportunity for the British factories and airfields to actually recover. Right, the British invested heavily in radar technology, something that the Germans did not. Even the Japanese did not invest that much on radar technology. I don't know whether it's quite odd. I'm quite sure they had the means to actually to make certain to grow in this area, but they just chose not to. And of course, the British home ground advantage, they are defending the skies, in a simple dogfight between a Spitfire against a German plane. I can't remember. Okay. If the pilot of the British plane ejected, somewhere in over the UK, wherever he lands, he will get immediate shelter, protection, food, and whatnot. The German who ejects off a plane over Britain, would be quickly captured and sent over to be interrogated. So yes, home ground advantage in that sense. Whatever planes that crash, they could still fix it. German planes that crash will be stripped for spare parts. So eventually, the importance of Britain became a substantial military base before Operation Overlord. All right, you had troops from all over the world, and became a massive base for the American army. Essentially, making D-Day landing and Allied bombing campaign possible. Their role for the success of Operation Overlord is second to none, right? Because of their strategic understanding of the beaches of Normandy. It was their intel that played quite a critical role in ensuring that things that success is as the possibility of success is as high as possible. Yeah, because you can't say that it was a sure thing, but it made their involvement made success as likely as possible. Okay, other areas in which we would say that they were important. Their survival also meant that the Japanese would have had less resistance in the Asia-Pacific region. Japanese had to fight off the Australians, the British, the Kiwis, the African troops in the APAC region. Their immense manpower and resource of India, right, contributed to 80% of the Allied war effort. I don't know how happy the people of these places were, but really at that time, yeah, that was the decision made at that point of time. There's no reason to, there is no reason to explore that further. But something that perhaps the ex-colonies do not get enough credit for today is their important role in contributing to the Allied success. And then finally, the importance of the Soviet Union in contributing to the German defeat at the Eastern Front. So yeah, and at times students, because they remember vividly things like Battle of Stalingrad or Kursk, and they talk about how yes, they were able to use the winter to gain a leg up and whatnot, but really the students didn't have any examples to actually illustrate why exactly why the Soviets had such an advantage. All right. So yeah, some of the things the Soviets did copied many German tactics and ideas. So they had their own version of Blitzkrieg later on. They had specialist tank armies and air force, and essentially a lot of their uh, yeah a lot of their weapons and their planes all had German tech behind it. Not that they used German engineering, but because they actually had spent some time partnering with the Germans in the 1920s. So they were able to actually utilize German tech and just make sure that it was superior. So the example I get students to use is the T-34 tank. And also the benefit of having just one good tank is that it's very easy to fix, right? Soviet engineers did not find it a challenge to fix the tanks. Germans found that their Panther tanks are very hard to fix, the Tiger tanks very hard to fix. Okay, their harsh discipline, Order 227, fight and die for the country, so not one step back. This was, of course, not published in the papers, but the Soviet commanders, of course, were drilling this message very clear that they are not to retreat if they were not ordered to. They had specialist units created to listen in on German radio signals and disrupt them. Radio comms were implemented in all tanks supplied by the Americans. And this was something that the Germans actually were also weaker at. The Germans, at some stage of the war, they were they were not keen to use their radio signals. I think because they kind of understood that uh, they have been compromised. So this was a disadvantage because it meant that even when they were not being monitored, they opted not to use their radio. Officers in the Red Army given greater freedom, and party officials banned from interfering with military decisions. So this is where you get awesome commanders like Zhukov and Chuikov. Chuikov was, of course, instrumental in the Battle of Stalingrad, and Zhukov instrumental in the Battle of Moscow. These are capable, competent, excellent. In fact, capable is not doing them justice. They were excellent commanders, uh, and their ability to lead without having to check with Stalin all the time gave them a lot of success as compared to the Germans who had to check everything back with Hitler. Resource and production to keep up. Some of the things they did to ensure that there was sufficient food for themselves. Adults received no food unless they worked in some way. Right, for both the men and the woman. The use of forced labor, secret police. All right, the Soviets also were amazing in the fact that in the early stages of the war, Operation Barbarossa, they were able to relocate their factories to behind the Volga River to make it further away from the Germans. And they actually, I don't know how to explain this, but they were able to, in my head, it's like a cut and paste kind of thing, but I'm quite sure it would be a lot more elaborate. But they were able to move large factories to uh, across large distances and then fix it all back and then start production all over again. Okay, other things, of course, they had vast resource and production. Their war economy produced vast amount of small range of reliable weapons like the T-34 tanks, the guns as well. I think this is where was this where they started having the Kalashnikovs? I'm not very sure. Yep. On their own, they equal and surpassed German war productions and were able to produce 1.5 times more planes and 2 times more tanks than the Germans. This was what I was saying. They were able to shift major industrial complexes, even though Germany captured their agricultural and industrial capacity, forced workers to migrate. Of course, they benefited from this aid through the Land Lease Act, and yeah, some of the key implications of all this was that by the time they fought the Germans at the Battle of Kursk, Soviet had 10 times as many tanks as the Germans, more artillery, more aircraft, and other weapons. Okay, and from the Battle of the Kursk, they were able to push the Germans really far back, all right, back into Poland and then back into Germany, where eventually the Soviet troops occupied Berlin and then forced Hitler to kill himself. Right? The one good thing Hitler did is to kill Hitler. America agreed to enter the war against Japan 3 months after the defeat at the Tehran and Yalta conference. So this was something they actually did because Germany surrendered in early May, June, July. August, Soviet Union declared war against Japan and launched invasions simultaneously on 3 fronts of Manchuria and were able to defeat the Kwantung Army and occupy North Korea. This could have been just as impactful as the atomic bomb in convincing the Japanese to actually surrender. Okay, we cannot understate this enough. Right, that means we are done with America, Britain, and the Soviet Union. Let's press on and talk about Germany and Japan and how they were responsible for their own defeats. Okay, just to mention that Italy itself is also a member of the Axis power, but they were not as they're not the main protagonists of the war. Germany and Japan was for the European and the Asian theater. Yeah. So German military weaknesses, actually there are a lot. We just need a few to include in a paragraph. Ineffective command structure. They had a navy, air force, and normal infantry, but they also had the SS army as well. And at times, the tank division also operated independently. So many branches, different from most armies, who at most have 3 branches of the army. German commanders had to constantly report back to Hitler, who regularly intervened in military decisions, often causing missed opportunities in terms of time. And of course, Hitler at times do not have the ground knowledge to actually make a good decision. And Hitler himself was never more than a corporal during World War I. So no real military combat experience. He tended to make decisions based on his experience as a soldier, which wasn't necessarily useful because he didn't manage like 3 million soldiers, for example, in a particular operation. So he will have certain blind spots. So some of the mistakes: halting the German advance, the tank division, when they were speeding towards Dunkirk, and then allowing the Luftwaffe to finish the job, despite the fact that the Luftwaffe did not have the sufficient numbers to actually finish the job. At the siege of Stalingrad, German commanders, Paulus, wanted to withdraw because it was not strategically important. It was, in a way, somewhat of a pointless battle. Hitler refused. Didn't allow General Paulus to withdraw. I think at that time there were maybe 9,000 at least German soldiers, maybe even more. There was a window of opportunity to withdraw. He did not allow them. And subsequently, that should be Army Group Center, substantially depleted after that pointless battle. And then from then on, Soviet Union were on the offensive. Choosing to declare war on America despite not having to do so, because the terms of the Tripartite Pact does not require Germany to attack or declare war on America, because Japan was the one who instigated the war. So this is like a technicality. Germany only needed to support Japan if Japan was attacked first. At Pearl Harbor, Japan was not attacked first. So Germany didn't even have to get involved, but Hitler insisted. So his decision, or the weakness, is having to fight a war on 2 fronts meant that their resources were always stretched. They chose to attack Soviet Union through Operation Barbarossa, something they chose to do, not necessarily had to do. They were actually quite in a very dominant position in Europe already. And given that they did not finish the job in defeating Britain, would it have been necessary to then drag, you know, open another front, given that they haven't fully closed the Western Front? Yep. So it was a highly ineffective strategy. The entry of America boosted Allied war efforts and provided more support on the Western Front, provided more support for Soviet Union on the Eastern Front as well. So ultimately, the inability to fight a war on two fronts quickly depleted Germany's resources, and it could not keep up with the quickened pace of the war. They did not have their own supply of oil. Their oil supplies came from Romania and other occupied territories. All this meant that at the time where they needed to produce more, they could not, because once the war was ongoing, they could not necessarily always secure their oil. Some other mistakes: failures in planning for naval warfare, ineffective use of surface ships, too much emphasis on building giant battleships and failed to build aircraft carriers. This would be Germany. They focused quite a bit on surface ships, and they didn't use it intelligently. Then subsequently, they used only submarines, which was effective at first, but once the radar technology had caught up, and once the Enigma machine was broken, they had no answer to the British Navy and the American Navy. Germany never developed heavy bombers like the RAF's Lancaster and the US B-17 bombers. So oftentimes their planes could not do heavy bombing. Unlike the British and the Americans, German bombers were too small and could not carry enough bombs. Radars, they never actually invested in it, unlike the British, and they consistently faced problems of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. Last but not least, Japan. The inter-service rivalry between the army and the navy, this dated back from the 1920s and 1930s. They didn't share information, they didn't share technology. They were reluctant to support one another. So their focus was always quite different. The Navy felt that they had a tougher job to defend the Japanese defensive perimeter in the Pacific Ocean. The army itself was more involved in the war with China. Yeah. So oftentimes when they did need to collaborate, they did not want to do so. They had different strategic goals and ideas for how they wanted to seize territories and obtain resources. Rivalry prevented, sharing of resources, military intelligence, and they couldn't coordinate well enough. For example, army refused to provide troops for an invasion of Australia, and they were unresponsive throughout the Pacific War. Basically, the main fighting between Japan and America was between the Japanese Navy and America. The Japanese army, who was more involved with, I would say, the invasion of China and some invasion of Southeast Asia. They refused to help reinforce the Pacific Islands. Both also could not agree where to set Japan's defensive perimeters against the Allied forces, especially after the loss at Midway. So their expanded empire, they had a large expanded empire running all the way from, all the way up to Manchuria, all the way down to Southeast Asia, to the East Indies. And the areas were stretched out. Rail and communications and road communications were poor, and it was difficult to deliver material that they had really sought after. As I was saying, the inefficiencies of having an overstretched empire whilst you have all this material at your disposal, getting them to your factories remained a challenge for Japan throughout the entire conflict. The raw materials, goods needed to be transported by sea, and this was a lot difficult compared to doing so by rail or by road. unlike in Europe, where there were already established lines of communication or established lines of established road networks or the railway network. So by sea, it required um, Japan at least to have dominance of the sea, which they did not. So over time, they were not able to keep up with production of their war material, and thus they could not replace their losses, making it quite clear that they cannot sustain a long war. Uh, yeah, they failed to understand that war at sea had changed in 1941. Um, Air power and aircraft carriers were the most important things as compared to the traditional battleships. They had this, the biggest one, the biggest warship, battleship ever created, I think the Yamato. Um, and it was wonderful. It was an extraordinary piece of engineering. I remembered that they had guns at the sides of the ship which could shoot out uh, projectiles the size of a car. All right, but battleship, despite it being so dominant and so such a marvel of engineering, uh, could easily be not, I wouldn't say easily, but if they are attacked by a swarm of planes that flew out from an aircraft carrier, they could be destroyed rather quickly. All right, so yeah, so a fundamental misunderstanding of this meant that battleships were targeted at Pearl Harbor, but aircraft carriers were not destroyed. Actually, to be fair, aircraft carriers were not even there. But the decision not to wait for the aircraft carriers proved to be costly. Had they chosen a date where the aircraft carriers were there, perhaps they could target that specifically. And it was actually uh, something that the admiral who was planning the Pearl Harbor attack had insisted on. Yeah, Yamamoto. All right. The lack of local support also meant that the locals were really against them. So brutal treatment of locals, brutal treatment of prisoners of war meant that they had to always expend effort to maintain their control over places in Malaya, which proved to be a drain on their resources. They couldn't focus their energies on America, for instance, because they had to deal with guerrilla warfare under led by Mao Zedong in Vietnam, the guerrilla warfare under Ho Chi Minh, and also basically anyone who could offer a resistance actually chose to fight against the Japanese because of their brutal treatment. Okay, we think we were quite familiar with this when we think of Suqing massacre in Singapore. Just think that there were multiple versions of this on a scale even more uh, terrifying done against the people of China. That's it meant that they could not focus their energies and their efforts at trying to defeat the main enemy during World War II, which was America, and they were had to keep on deploying troops in different parts of Asia to fight the resistance movement. Okay, so ultimately, of course, they were defeated by the atomic bomb, but by then, actually, it was obvious that they would be defeated, but just a manner in which how they wanted the terms of the surrender to look like. That was actually the main obstacle. Right, so that's all.